When Julie Loar was interviewed on Chief for Yourself, she told us about the diverse examples of the divine feminine through time and across cultures. Her book, Goddesses for Every Day, exploring the wisdom and power of the divine feminine around the world, is intended to make every woman feel like a goddess, strong, wise, brave, and loving. Julie Loar, our guest on Chief for Yourself.
In Goddesses for Every Day, we get a look at 366 goddesses, a goddess a day. Tell us how you structured the book and why you did it this way.
It was kind of a long process, actually. At the beginning, I wanted to do something that sort of was organized more by feminine numbers. I thought it'd be nice to do by the lunar cycle. But ultimately, I just decided that the zodiac was a frame that most people are familiar with and that I'm familiar with. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. So then of course, I had to decide how, out of actually the thousands of goddesses I found, I had no idea before I started this how many there actually were in cultures around the world. Then I had to sort of decide how would I divide them into the zodiac. So as I did my research, I just organized them based on the qualities that seemed to resonate most with me, their different characteristics. And then as part of that process, I don't know if you know Judith Orloff, if you've ever spoken with her. She has an expression I love, that the shower is the psychic phone booth. So, isn't that great?
That is
so
good.
One morning, and it seems to be true for me, so one morning in the shower I had this idea. I wonder if I can find an alignment between the symbols that show up around the world representing the sacred feminine and the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so sure enough, that happened, and that's how what I call the goddess signs were born. I use the dove for Libra and the tree of life for Taurus, the bee for Gemini, and so forth. And so after that, it was a process of fitting the different goddesses in, as I said, where they seem to resonate most with the particular zodiac sign.
Now, when a lot of us hear the word goddess, we think of a myth, something that isn't real. Yet there are real life figures in the book. Mary Magdalene, for one, that took me back to my parochial school days. Mary Magdalene having been a bad girl, according to my teaching. How does she figure into the structure of the goddesses?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to back up a second. Using it, you mentioned the word myth, and that word actually comes from a root word which means mouth, because most of these stories were originally oral traditions. And in fact, myths, it's not true anymore. When we say myth, we usually mean something that isn't true. But in more ancient times, that was the way people transmitted their most sacred knowledge, their holiest truth. So it's a different connotation in the past and now. But to answer your question about Mary Magdalene, and, it's rightly so, modern scholars are realizing there's absolutely nothing in the Bible to imply that there was anything wrong with her character. The fact that she became, in the words of Pope Gregory I, a penitent whore, was entirely his doing, close to year 600 of the current era, when he delivered a homily and said he decided that Mary Magdalene was the same person as someone in the Gospel of Luke. So that's where that idea came from, out of the mind of a human pope. But she went through a lot. I could argue that perhaps in modern times, or in our own time, she was a person who wrongly was accused of something that was not true. But she's now a Catholic saint. Her fide is July the 22nd. And I think a case can be made that many of the goddesses began as human women too, who overcame amazing odds or who learned to use supernatural powers. So the idea that someone who began as a remarkable human woman could be considered as a saint and also as a goddess, or certainly as a feminine archetype to be revered and respected.
People often see the goddess figure as sort of frozen in antiquity. Society reduced the role of the goddess over time. In the West, the goddess is a concept really to be avoided. How did that happen? Take us through the timeline.
Wow, and again, how it happened is one of the questions that I'm not sure anybody has the right answer to. I think we just don't know how. But approximately Well, certainly, even 6,000 years ago of history that we somewhat know, from Sumeria and then Egypt 5,000 years ago, and around that time as well, 5 to 4,000 years ago, was the culture that's called Minoan in Crete. And the goddess is alive and well during those time frames, and so it's been an evolution over time. It seems to have begun approximately 4,000 years ago with the advent of the patriarchy, the advent of what is often called the Age of Heroes, when war and domination and conquering seem to take on more of an importance. And slowly the tide turned and shifted, and we see that in the myths and how the quality, here again, of these stories began to change, especially in Greece. But of course now we're seeing a real shift and a real turn again. I don't think anybody can argue that around the world there seems to be a resurgence of the feminine principle, of the sacred feminine. So I imagine now, after the pendulum swinging so far to the masculine side, that now we're going to see, hopefully, something which comes more into equilibrium, that's more balanced.
I think there is something, a lesson of sorts in this for men as well, something very important. What should a man take away from a book like Goddesses for Every Day?
I think that would be my hope as well. And my own sense of it is, I don't know whether this is correct, but my own sense of it is that all of us, all of humanity, except maybe indigenous cultures in different parts of the world, have lost track, have sort of had amnesia of the true nature of feminine energy or feminine power or the feminine side of the divine. And my feeling is that probably women need to understand it first, and then with the idea of reclaiming some of this so that men can recognize it. But certainly, as others have said, whether we're in a male body or a female body, we each have all of the qualities and characteristics. Certain things just may be stronger in men than they are in women. But I think it's important. I had a boss back in corporate America. He was quoting someone else, and so far no one's been able to tell me who he was quoting, but his expression was, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Oh, yes.
If you heard that, I thought that was I thought that was such a great line. I never forgot it. And I think in many ways that's what's happened to us in the West. And we've had this idea that sort of what's become more of a characteristic male approach to things, very hierarchical, very top-down, very, if I'm right, you're wrong. And whether those are truly essentially male qualities, we've made them that way. Or we've said that the men are supposed to know the answers to everything or be the strong ones. Again, all of that is changing, but I think it could be amazingly important and valuable for a man to get in touch with some of these qualities within himself. And, men have sisters and mothers and daughters, so helping them understand the feminine side of something, I think, is really helpful.
In such a fundamentalist-leaning world, what will it take to bring the goddess more to the forefront of our minds and give her, for lack of a better word, more respect?
I think that's the perfect word, actually. It's happening. I have daughters and granddaughters, and I see such a difference between what was available in my generation versus the difference in my daughter's generation, and then now for my grandchildren. It's a big difference. I think it's happening. I do think it's happening in spite of what might be reactionary responses to certain things that perhaps the nature of the times will bring it about. I don't know. It's a hard thing to say. I think openness on the one hand. I think willingness to explore these issues on the part of both women and men. I don't have an axe to grind. My point is not to go back to some matriarchy where women are in charge and men are subordinate. That's not my idea. I just think that it's important for all of us to recognize the difference in these qualities. It would be great to know, and maybe the answer to your question is another generation or two. Hopefully that we haven't blown ourselves off the planet in that amount of time.
What did you personally gain from researching and writing the book?
It was such an experience, and I think how guidance works. My background, my education is in psychology, so I've always been interested in that field, the language of archetypes and Jung's description of the principle of synchronicity, things that happened without causes that we can perceive. And writing this book was a different journey for me about the nature of guidance. I feel like I became very open to how this might work, and so for me it was a recognition of how it isn't just a simple left brain research. There's a very right-brained, to use an expression, process of creativity. It was also certainly for me very empowering to find out that all this knowledge and ancient wisdom existed, and to know that in indigenous cultures like Hawaiian and Maori and Aboriginal and African cultures, primarily black African cultures in Africa, still revere the feminine, and in many cases, Hawaii, for example, and India too. The goddesses are alive and well, and Tara in the Buddhist tradition. So all of that was a revelation for me, and really so strengthening to know that all of that existed. I kept asking myself, why don't I know this? Why aren't we taught this in school? And as the question you asked near the beginning, how did it happen that all of that sort of just became background or completely forgotten? So it's maybe stronger.
Along with goddesses, there are historical names too, names like Joan of Arc. Are Joan of Arc type figures meant to be, did you mean them to be role models, let's say, or did they just kind of find their way into the book?
The answer for Joan of Arc is in many ways similar to Mary Magdalene, and likewise Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, who I included in the circle as well. Joan of Arc is another extraordinary figure from history, whose story that we know, who had visions, and who was a young girl. I believe she was only 14 or something when she started going into battle. I mean, extraordinary for any time frame, but certainly the time in which she lived. She then became a victim of the church's corrupt power at that time and was burned at the stake by a corrupt court. And then later, that verdict was overturned. She too now is a Catholic saint. So the idea of the life that she lived and how she saw miraculous visions, but yes, most definitely a role model, someone who followed her truth, who followed her guidance and faced death courageously in the face of such horrible mistreatment. So to me, that's someone worth admiring and worth modeling behavior after.
One final question, and we'll let you go. How can the reader benefit from the book's guidance? Does she bring questions to the reading or allow the process just to unfold?
I'm hearing from people that it can be used in a lot of different ways. Some people use it as a sort of a daily meditation, or use the book every day and maybe read it in the morning, the goddess of the day, or at noon, or in the evening. The contemplations that come at the bottom of each page can be used both as inspiration or in a way as a call to action to explore what that particular goddess might mean for them or might teach them as a role model, either because they're not all sweetness and light. Other people have suggested or use it in a bit like an oracle, asking a question and then fanning the pages or letting them fall open in what looks like a random way, and then using the goddess where their eyes are drawn, again, like an answer to a question. Mm-hmm. So people are using it in different ways, and I probably do all of the above as a way to just learn more about this subject.